Okay, so very few words. I don't think that Andrew Finberg needs much introduction, but I'll just spend 2 words to mention him as a philosopher who teaches at the Simon Fraser University of Vancouver. He's been working on critical theory, the philosophy of praxis, especially Lukács and the Frankfurt School. And what is very interesting to me and to many of us, he has been developing a leftist approach to STS. That's also part of his talk today. Among his books, I'd like to mention The Philosophy of Praxis, Marx, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School, a book published in 2014, and Technosystem, The Social Life of Reason, a book that was printed in 2017. He's been working extensively on, among other things, on Marcuse. Marcuse is also the subject, and Marcuse's thought is the subject of today's talk, which, just to mention conversations that we've been having, the legacy of whom Andrew is connecting with issues of historicism, and that led Andrew also to engage with a possible intellectual connection, more than possible, the intellectual connection in the background of Lukács and Gramsci. So today's talk is Marcuse's critique of technology. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can see yourself. Also the public.
Let's see if I can move the slide. Unfortunately, the slides won't show, I guess, if I show. It's one or the other. But it's not, the slides are not so important. So I start with the question, why Marcuse? The reason why I wouldn't have to ask that question if I was saying Adorno's critique of technology or Deleuze's critique of technology. These are the fashionable thinkers who everybody is sure has something important to tell us. Marcuse is pretty much eclipsed by these others in the last 30 years or so. However, there was a time when he was the most famous philosopher on earth, with the possible exception of Jean-Paul Sartre. So something happened. And I think this is partly connected to his critique of technology, because what you observe when you look at the Frankfurt School and its evolution under the influence of Habermas is the disappearance of the critique of instrumental reason. Instrumental reason becomes finally just a practical phenomenon that has no specific bias, no relation to the problem of domination, nothing to worry about. So unless it, of course, intrudes into regions where it isn't welcome. But this Habermasian solution doesn't make much sense any longer in a world that is obsessed now by technical issues, by climate change, by the pandemic, by surveillance. The same evolution occurs in STS, where you start out with thinkers like Marcuse in the 60s, Ellul, Heidegger's famous question concerning technology. These thinkers raise broad questions about technology and its dangers. And then STS takes over and these questions disappear, more or less disappear for 20, 30 years as STS evolves into, yeah, no, STS is science and technology studies. This is an academic discipline that did not exist in the 1960s, but at the time there was the history of science. But that was a very small field. Now it is a large field, largely because technology has become so important in people's lives, but it evolved out of a conscious decision to make what Wiebe Bijker called an academic detour. In other words, to stop talking about nuclear power and the dangers of technology, and just work on it as another subject, like, plants for botany or chemicals for chemistry. So there'd be technology for science and technology studies. And this decision enabled science and technology studies to establish itself in the university, but without a real self-awareness of the reasons why it was so successful. And the success was largely due to the fact that the environment was becoming increasingly concerned about technology as throughout the 1990s and with the emergence of the environmental movement and so on. So you have the historical situation in which the issues raised by someone like Marcuse in the 1960s appear as a background to all kinds of other things that are going on in critical theory, in science and technology studies, but are not thematized properly because we don't do the critique of technology anymore. That's old stuff. That's the new left. That's another era in which we're happily no longer engaged. So what I think is that Marcuse can help us to overcome this blindness toward the most important issues that now confront us. And it's really important that we do this because the irrelevance of both critical theory and certain aspects of science and technology studies in our present situation is quite disturbing. It's really strange that we have these very sophisticated and rich theoretical traditions that don't want to talk about the most important things to us. Or if they do, it's in terms so remote from reality that it actually is just an intellectual game that people can play among themselves. Whereas I think with Marcuse, we have someone who can help us to engage much more directly and at a high theoretical level with the real issues. Now, I should confess that I'm a student of Marcuse's. I was one of his last, I think his last two doctoral students. So I have a bias toward Marcuse, but everybody has a bias, so we won't worry about that. Now, I was his student, and he himself was a student of Husserl and Heidegger. And that has a big impact on his thought. Even though he's a Marxist from the very beginning, even while studying with Heidegger, he wrote Marxist documents. Is there a way to close the door?
Children coming back from outside.
Oh, so even in Venice.
It's children getting back from school, probably.
I see. So it
will be so.
Yeah, too bad. It was nice having the windows open. But it's hard to think with children playing. So what Marcuse did was he learned from Husserl and Heidegger about the Lebenswelt, the life world. He learned the central importance of this concept for any philosophy that wants to escape from naturalism, from scientific naturalism, that wants to be able to credit values as something real and significant rather than just mere, fantasies of the human brain. He learned this from them, and he learned a lot more too, some of which we'll discuss. But he incorporated it into his Marxism. At first, in a very explicit way that's quite clear. If you read the essays he wrote in the late 1920s and early 30s, it's quite clear that he's using phenomenological concepts right and left. But then it is muted. He joins the Frankfurt School. Heidegger is the devil. He plays down his relation to phenomenology, and yet it's still there, and it's still necessary to appreciate it in order to understand some of the stranger and more interesting things going on in his later writings. So Marcuse, in a sense, bridges the two major philosophical traditions of European philosophy until the 1970s or 80s. The whole first part of the century is all about the contest between phenomenology and Marxism, existentialism versus Marxism. And this Marcuse tried to bridge this gap implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly in his thought. So the reason why I think this turns out to be so important is that from phenomenology, Marcuse is able to escape from traditional Marxist ideas of class consciousness, which are too rationalistic to actually really help us understand resistance to the existing society. It's not just about people having opinions, having learned something from reading Capital, or having economic interests which are better fulfilled under socialism than under capitalism. These are all rationalistic ideas about consciousness. Marcuse draws from phenomenology the notion of a world, of a lived world in which people are engaged both mentally and physically. They're both thinkers and actors. And this is a world in which reactions to the problems of the society can become almost, you'd think, almost somatic, almost part of the lived experience of the individuals, not just an opinion, but something that they can't really fail to experience, to understand, to react to. So there's a kind of existential weight to political resistance in Marcuse that's missing in a lot of Marxist theory. I think this comes entirely from his studies with Husserl and Heidegger, which he then applies, for example, to the New Left in the 1960s, when he becomes such a famous thinker. The second reason why he's such an important figure for me is because he emphasizes the role of capitalism in the technological crises of the time. Now, there's an awful lot of talk in science and technology studies inspired by Bruno Latour, and in other areas, animal studies, I don't know, there's all kinds of stuff going on in philosophy that I don't follow too closely. But most of it is about how the nature-culture divide is the cause of all our problems. Or maybe it's Descartes, but it's something like that. It's some intellectual concept that we have not understood properly, that we've been misled into thinking it makes sense when it doesn't. This, I think, is complete nonsense politically. There is no problem of the nature-culture divide. In the political realm in which we're fighting over the question of whether we will deal with climate change, there's simply conflict between different institutions with different powers over how to deal with it. And the most powerful of these institutions are capitalist corporations. And they don't care whether there's a nature-culture divide. And, you know, forget it. All they care about is the bottom line, making money. And the people who resist, who demonstrate, the kids who skip school on Friday and so on, they too they're not involved in this abstruse philosophical debate. They're concerned about their future. So Marcuse, because he was a Marxist, when he entered the question of technology, he entered it with a very strong sense of the role of capitalism in the problems. And of course, the environmental movement became important in the 1970s, in the late 70s. Marcuse was still there, and he responded to it. He could see in the environmental movement exactly what he was talking about all this time. Let's say the contest between human life and capitalism. Okay, now I'm going to describe what I'm going to do next, now that I've explained why. Let me see if I can. I'm going to show that there are three different critiques of technology in Marcuse. And these three critiques take us to a certain place. But they don't solve all of our problems. But they're interesting and significant, and they get us on the right track to a better solution than he was able to come up with, but still something closely related to his own intuitions, his own approach. So let me first run down the three critiques. The first two are social critiques. Um, in the first one concerns technology as ideology. This is a phrase that he uses in One-Dimensional Man. He says technology is ideology. Of course, that's kind of confusing because we usually think of ideology as something that's false, and science explains why it's false, except of course if you're a Gramscian. But Marcuse really means that, what he really means is that technology plays a legitimating role in the social system. It defines all the things that you're supposed to do and that you can hope for. It defines all those things now that it covers the entire surface of society, so that actually you don't need to or want to think about anything beyond what this social world offers. It's a kind of legitimation process that's different, say, from the role of the Catholic Church, say, in legitimating the society by telling people to obey the authorities. And it's not like that. It's the actual material world itself now legitimates the system by prescribing all the actions, all the hopes that people can entertain. So there's a whole way of life, in other words, associated with a fully technified society like ours. And that way of life contains no place for a transcending notion of how to get beyond the limits of our social world and move on to a better way of life. And this is instantiated not only in the material culture, but also in the mode of thought that is characteristic of such a society, where everybody sees technology as the solution to all problems. Technical thinking takes over. Utopian ideas no longer have any currency. The notion that something might be a social problem that requires radical change in the social organization no longer appeals to people. They think it's a technical problem that ought to have a solution. I remember actually when I first really understood how nefarious this thinking is, I had a professor who was quite an important person in the philosophy profession in America when I was an undergraduate, who joined a committee organized by the Pentagon during the Vietnam War to help them get advice on how to handle the problem of communism in Vietnam. And the committee had discussions, and they were looking for solutions to the problem also of student protest. And one member of the committee formulated, I found this because somebody was revealing whistleblowing type thing, right? Someone was revealing the minutes of one of their meetings. And my professor was in there, so I was interested. One of the people in the meeting, some sociologist, said, we have to find the operational components of student protest. And so another one was saying, well, what about the sexual frustration of students? Maybe if the dorm hours were changed. And they went on like this, everything except ending the war in Vietnam, right? Because that's not an operational component. You can't touch the fundamental policy. Only these little things, the little things you could fix in order to solve the problem. So you can see how with such a mentality, the idea of socialist revolution is not going to be very appealing. So that's the first critique. It's a critique of the material effects of technology and the mode of thought associated with it. The second critique is a critique of Max Weber's theory of rationalization. Now, you know who Weber is. Weber is the founder of German sociology. At least he's one of them. A very important thinker in the history of thought in the 20th century. And he proposed that modern societies are different from traditional societies because they have rationalized the social institutions. And by rationalization, he meant something very specific. He said calculation and control. Our institutions, unlike those of, say, medieval Europe, are based on calculation of resources, of costs, of benefits, and so on, and control of the human elements and the material processes. We have precision in both departments, and this makes us radically different as a society from pre-modern society. Well, this is obviously true in some sense, but Marcuse argues that it is ideological. Why? Because what Weber has overlooked is the fact that in an advanced capitalist society, the form of action, the way things get done, always involves control from above, management from above. And it's the management from above that sets the terms of calculation and control in a modern capitalist society. So this is significant. This is not trivial. It means that there are many effects on the social world that result from the simple fact that all control arises from above. That for example, the workers in a factory don't organize their own management, but are organized by management. And so, I mean, you can imagine some of the consequences of that. For, say, what are the highest priorities for management? They might be the profit of enterprise. What are the highest priorities for workers? It might be safety, health and safety on the job, and so on. So you can see how control from above could bias all the decisions that are made. And it could also bias the technical designs, because the designs now have to pace work and control the labor force. And so the assembly line is the example that is always given of this capitalist biased technological design, which presumably workers, if they had any alternative, would not employ because it's so, boring and painful to way to work. So the rationalization thesis of Weber is contains, on the one hand, a realistic view of how things actually work, but on the other hand, it masks the bias of a capitalist society, the fact that there's always an alternative, or almost always an alternative, in which control would not come from above, but from the organized work group itself. Okay, so that's the second critique, and that involves technical rationality and how it is structured by the technical disciplines of a capitalist society in every field, right? In social science, in accounting, management theory, and so on. Okay, but there's a third critique, and this is the tricky one. This is the critique of science and technology as ontology, not just as ideology, but as not just as legitimating sciences, but as an actual ontology that defines what is and what is not for the whole society. So this third critique concerns the real. What is real? And of course, real in a historically modulated sense, right? Because Marcuse is a historicist, like most Marxists in Western Europe. Certainly Gramsci or Lukács or Karl Korsch or Bloch, the whole Frankfurt School, they all believe that what is real is historically relative. But what is real for us, for moderns in a capitalist society? Well, what is real, Marcuse here follows Husserl and Heidegger in arguing that what is real for us was established by Galileo when he developed physics as the paradigmatic science of modern times. So what is real in this paradigmatic science? The primary qualities, matter in motion essentially, measurable aspects of the material world. These primary qualities are what is ultimately real. And Marcuse says that this results in a one-dimensional notion of experience, a one-dimensional idea of experience. One-dimensional in the sense that other dimensions of experience that are commonplace in everyday consciousness of the world disappear from physics. Physics doesn't need your dreams and hopes. It doesn't need your sense of beauty. It doesn't need, of course, for Galileo's time, colors and smells and all those things, which you can't account for. Maybe today there's some theory of that, but the idea of the reduction of experience to simply what can be measured, what can be measured in matter and motion, that reduction is one-dimensional. The other dimension is lost. And that other dimension, of course, doesn't cease to exist. People still have a sense of beauty. They still have feelings and so on. But it's all now attributed to the mind. It's subjective. It's not objective. What's objective is just what can be measured. So here Marcuse's phenomenological background comes into play. In One-Dimensional Man, he explains Husserl's theory of the life world and its relation to science, and adapts it to his own Marxist approach. Husserl argued that the concepts of science, essentially Galilean science, are all refined versions of life world concepts. So we have, for example, an experience of space, and we have ways of measuring space in our everyday experience. And these experiences get refined and processed into the concept of space that is used by physics, essentially a Euclidean space. And so for Husserl, science is not really independent of the life world. It takes itself out of the life world as far as it can go, right? But in the end, all its concepts ultimately are derived from the life world. I mean, you have, you know, it's so obvious, actually. Think about like neuroscience. The neuroscientists want to know how memory is stored in the brain. But the concept of memory is a life world concept. It only exists because you can remember things. It's part of your inner experience. And that creates then a notion which we call memory, which can be objectified, and then they can go and look for it in your skull, right? So, but it's obviously dependent on an experience which is not itself measurable or calculable or located in space. So this notion then that science emerges out of the life world suggests to Marcuse a consideration that Husserl would never have entertained. If you have this historicist view that he holds as a Marxist, then the life world is not one and the same for all time. It's not the same for the Greeks and for us. Our life world is shaped by capitalism. Fundamental practices and concepts emerge from the capitalist structure of our experience. And that then is brought into science as the concepts are refined and developed as scientific concepts. And this idea relates very closely to Heidegger's question concerning technology, because you're, I'm sure, familiar with this famous essay in which Heidegger shows that modern technology differs from ancient technology. Heidegger, too, is a kind of historicist, because it views the world as resources for a subject rather than as containing potentialities that could develop with, say, some help from human beings. So here's a very fundamental notion for Marcuse, the concept of potentiality that's already present in Heidegger and which he then develops in his Marxist approach. But take a moment here to think about this notion of potentiality. This, in Aristotle's metaphysics, potentiality is a dimension of being. Ousia, substance, has potentials. That's part of its essence. There were actually there was actually a school of thought called the Megarians who denied the existence of potentialities. And Aristotle spends a few pages showing why they're wrong. And he says, he literally says, a thing can be and yet not be, and it cannot be and yet be, which is, of course, what potential is, right? It's not there, but it's there. So in the ancient world, the craftsman brings out the potentialities of the materials, just like the farmer brings out the potentialities of the soil and the plants. This idea of potentiality disappears in modern times. It's not in the Galilean physics. There's no place for it. So what then happens is that the world appears completely naked of its own sources of development, just there available for any kind of purpose that human beings want to impose upon it. And Marcuse pretty much takes over something quite similar. He says at one point that society has a project, and this project is capitalism. And this project, here he's thinking of Sartre's use of the term project and being a nothingness. But it's also, he even uses the Heideggerian existentiale, Vorhaben, to talk about it, which is the idea not of a specific project, but of a space within which projects make sense. So capitalism is a kind of space within which certain kind of projects make sense and others don't. If you engage in the others, you lose money. So you're out of the game. So this could be the only possible excuse for Mark Zuckerberg. He's just the survivor. So there's a capitalist life world, and this is a world in which things are simply there to be exploited and dominated. And the scientific concepts emerge out of this world and reflect it, and the technological designs reflect it. So what happens then? Well, instead of potentialities, we have values. In the life world, we sense potentialities all the time. I mean, you're aware, like if you're around a plant or a child, you know they're going to grow. We're constantly aware of potentialities, but in the one-dimensional world of an advanced capitalist society, those potentialities are just attributed to, they're blocked out, so to speak, or just attributed to our particular sense. You know, for example, the teleological notion that a child is going to grow up, that makes sense to us in everyday experience, but maybe it has no scientific meaning because it's just a bunch of causal processes, and they could go in any direction. They could, you know, they tend to go in one direction, but it's not a potentiality. It's just, you know, some machinery that operates in a certain direction when not disturbed. So the elimination of potentialities then leaves the world subject to pure valuative understanding. We can, our intentions are simply subjective. And what we make of the world, what we do with men and things, Marcuse says, comes from subjective values. And this then has a dystopian quality in an advanced capitalist society where the level of technification is so developed that you can imagine everything being brought under the control of the one-dimensional machinery. And it's a kind of dystopian outlook that, I mean, you get this now with surveillance, right? Marcuse was not so concerned with surveillance as with other things, but today, think about the fact that they know everything about you, right? And they can manipulate you. And so even though you personally might escape, you could be like Bernard Marx in Brave New World, you know, one of the ones who escaped, whose conditioning broke down. Still, as a mass, everything is predictable. And human beings are simply relays that move money between their salary and the place where the things they consume. You're just a relay that is entirely operated by this dystopian system. But people really worry about this, right? The Matrix is going for a second sequel, I think. So this dystopianism However, Marcuse knew that he was proposing a quasi-dystopian theory with his notion of one-dimensionality. And yet, at the same time, he points out in the introduction that there may perhaps be forces that can break through the dystopian system. So he's willing to admit the possibility of a breakthrough. He has to as a Marxist. Right? And in fact, what happened? In the 1960s, dystopian popular culture became so influential that people started to think in terms of dystopia. Not just a few intellectuals, right? Like in Brave New World, but millions of people. Dystopia was on everybody's thoughts because of the movies, because of the books they were reading. And
Walking Dead.
Pardon?
The Walking Dead.
Yeah.
Series.
Yeah, but also many films show. I mean, in the Italian films too, like La Dolce Vita is a dystopian narrative. Yeah, it is. It's ultimately dystopian because the hero becomes a commercial writer. He is absorbed into the system. Everything is absorbed into the system. So that first image of the statue of Jesus being carried by a helicopter over Rome, we know who's in charge. It's not Jesus. He's being just moved around. And it ends up with the hero, instead of being a writer, a serious writer, he becomes and the one character who is the real philosopher, he commits suicide. So it's a dead world. And so this idea then captures the imagination of so many young people that it becomes a factor in the development of political resistance. And you have the New Left emerging in part out of dystopian anxieties about society. So it's a kind of paradox that the discourse of dystopia generates the opposite of dystopia, namely resistance. So, okay, so Marcuse in the 60s and 70s developed around this emergence of the New Left, of new forms of resistance that had the existential quality that he associated with real resistance, a real possibility of change. He associated this then with the project of socialism. And he imagined a socialist revolution possible, but not likely. He was never a real optimist, but at least possible. At least you could think about it again, whereas you couldn't any longer think about the proletarian revolution of the 19th and early 20th century. That was over, in Marcuse's view anyway. And we haven't seen a lot of evidence that he was wrong since 1968, which was really the last time there was anything that resembled a proletarian movement against capitalism. And that was in France and Italy. So this was the new movement that could bring the utopia back to life, right? The socialist idea back to life. And in this context, he then proposed that technology and science would have to change because they were the fundamental infrastructure, the basis of the technified capitalist system. Now, how can we understand this? This is a very, to me, a strange idea. The idea that there could be what was sometimes called a successor science. So our science is historically located in a certain era of history. When that era passes, socialism takes over, there'll be an entirely new organization of the social system, and then the science will change too, along with other institutions. Now, Marcuse was not silly. He didn't think that this would happen because a commissar would tell you what the truth was. He said, scientists will have different experiences. Their life world will change, and that will result in different concepts being developed into scientific concepts. And so he doesn't give a time limit for this. I mean, this could take generations, but he sees the possibility of a new kind of science. So what would be different about this science? Well, this is where things get tricky. He says it will retain the rigidity of science as we know it. So it will not be a qualitative science. It'll still use measurement, precise measurement, and be based on empirical facts and so on. However, it will also incorporate potentialities into its structure. And he imagines this in some texts as having to do with a sort of merger of art and science. Art is the space in which potentiality can be freely developed and idealized, right? Science stuck in its one-dimensional system of measurements. If the two could be merged somehow, then science would no longer be confined to the one-dimensional world of primary qualities, but could incorporate secondary qualities. Still, I mean, that doesn't really work. There's no way back from a modern formal science to the concrete data from which it's abstracted. And this is, I mean, you think about what is a scientific equation like? I mean, say distance equals speed times time. That's a formula, right? The distance you can travel is a function of the speed at which you go and the time that you're traveling. So that's a scientific formula. How can you ever get anything concrete in there? I mean, you could specify the variables, but in doing so, you specify only that component of the variables that's relevant to the equation. So, you know, the distance times time, the distance plus speed times time to get from here to San Marco doesn't include any of the beautiful buildings of Venice. It's completely abstracted. So this is a type of abstraction, a formal abstraction, which admits of no concrete data. There's simply no way to incorporate concrete data back into the formal abstraction. Now, this is different from a mere generalization. You know, if you say Venice is in Italy, you can then say, you can get more concrete. There's Italy, there's Venice, there's San Marco, there's the lion on the, you know, you can specify. Whereas you can't with distance equals speed times time, velocity times time, there's nothing to specify that's concrete. It's all still in the form of an abstraction. So, and this is the nature of modern science. It's not something accidental to it. It's the nature anyway of physics. Maybe this would not be true of geology, say, but certainly it is true of physics. So I think Marcuse has a problem. Right? He wants a different ontology to emerge with a different social world, but he doesn't seem to have a way of making it emerge, given that he has focused everything on physics as the ontological foundation of modernity. So we need to escape from that assumption, right? That assumption that physics is a kind of paradigm for what is real. Only if we abandon that assumption can we somehow figure out a different way for reason to operate in a different kind of social system. But why would Marcuse have made this what I think of as a mistake? Well, you have to know the social context. What were the struggles over science in the 1960s and early 70s? What were they? Well, there were essentially none. There was a tiny nuclear movement in the US against nuclear weapons. There wasn't even against nuclear power plants, but the environmental movement begins to have some influence in the 70s, but it's very small compared to today when everyone takes it for granted. In the early 70s, it was viewed largely as, you know, the product of a sort of anti-modern hysteria by romantics. The real flowering of the environmental movement happens after Marcuse's death. So when he looks at the world from the standpoint of what's going on with science, he sees physics. That's the dominant science that everything seems to depend on. And with his background, with Husserl and Heidegger in the background, right, he's got some theoretical concepts with which to work on this. It just so happens, though, that in the 80s and 90s, there's a tremendous development of struggles around science and technology in many fields. There's the feminist movement and the resistance to traditional childbirth procedures. There's the AIDS movement of gay people resisting the established methods for experimental medicine. There's various different types of environmental movements about air pollution, water pollution, toxic waste dumps, and eventually, of course, the biggest of them all, climate change. And so all these movements give us a very different sense of science from the sense that Marcuse had in the 60s. And I think this enables us to make a move that he couldn't make. He's almost there, but he doesn't quite make the move. And the move is to not look for a way of incorporating the data back into physics, but rather to look at the technical disciplines that actually structure the world we live in, to look at those technical disciplines and to see how social movements alter and change them, and to develop a theory then of what, at one point, Marcuse actually uses the term translation, the translation between social movements and the technical disciplines that structure the world. Now, Marcuse uses that term at one point, and when I saw that, I thought, oh, wow, this is a concept that's developed in science and technology studies 30 years later. This is what Latour calls delegation, right? It's translation, delegation. These are concepts in science and technology studies that enable you to talk about how, in Latour's example, a speed bump, a bump in the road, slows cars down, and it is a delegation of a normative principle, go slow. So go slow is the verbal form. You could put it on a sign, but you could also, so then you've delegated from the voice that says go slow to the sign, the same normative principle, but you could also put it in the material structure of the road as a speed bump. And that delegation is a translation in Latourian terms of the normative principle, go slow, into, it's translated into the agency of the material world. It's wonderful. It's all happening in the 1990s, right? When Latour is becoming famous. The concept is there in Marcuse in 1964. And yet he didn't quite figure out how to use it. So you can look at the passage and you'll see he thinks that somehow you could translate values into technical terms, which is sort of right, but it sounds, the way he puts it, it sounds more like economic planning, something like that. Like it doesn't quite do the work that the concept of translation does. In order to make that concept functional for a politics of technology, we need a concept that Marcuse didn't develop except sort of implicitly in his essay on Weber's theory of rationalization. And that concept is the concept of object construction. What is the object of a engineering discipline, like automotive engineering? The object of that discipline is the automobile in its various material aspects. What's the object of medicine? It's the human body as subject to disease. Every science has an object of some sort. You can actually find this concept of object in Plato, in the Gorgias, where he explains that each science has a specific object, but he also says there's also fake versions of each science, a simulacrum of the science. So there's medicine, which makes you healthy, and there's cookery, which pretends to make you healthy because it gives you a good flavor, which you might think is good for you. When little children say, chocolate cake is good for me, when they mean that it tastes good. So Plato has already got some sort of a concept like this, but by the time you get to Kant, right, and the post-Kantians in the late 19th century in Germany, this becomes a fundamental aspect of the discussion of science. Each science has its object. Well, those objects in Marcuse's scheme of things would incorporate practices and values developed in the life world. And now we're not talking about physics anymore, but about all the different technosciences that structure our world. whether it's dietetics that helps them make fast food for us, or engineering, which builds us bridges and automobiles, or medicine that takes care of our physical health, and so on. Just keep naming, interior architecture, which constructs spaces like this and determines how much air they need for how many people. And so everything is structured like this. The term Heidegger uses for this is Gestell, the framework that frames everything. But the word Gestell in German can also be used to signify skeleton. There is a scientific skeleton to everything in a technified society. And that skeleton incorporates assumptions, just as in Weber's theory of rationalization, as Marcuse analyzes it. It incorporates assumptions that are valuative and that respond to the capitalist life world. When people protest, when social movements emerge, those movements are trying to alter the object of the science. So when people, for example, in Los Angeles protested the levels of pollution that had caused the air in their city to turn yellow, they were demanding that the automobile become a different object, not just a means of transportation, but also an environmental object. And that meant that the engineers had to change their science. They had to add chapters on catalytic converters and fuel injection and so on in order to turn the automobile into this new object, which concerns not only movement in space, but also the quality of the air that it moves through. So in all these spheres, social movements are altering the object. They're changing the object. There's a translation between life world issues, concerns that are inadequately represented by the scientific technical environment. There's a translation between those life world concerns and the technical disciplines that ultimately construct that environment. So this is a way of getting to a kind of successor science, an almost Marcusean successor science that actually fits with what's happened historically since his death, and which makes more sense than his own attempt to imagine a new kind of physics. So we're really at the end here, because I've talked long enough. I think what we can get from Marcuse is the beginnings of the initial elements of a technical a politics, a political theory of technology, a political theory of technoscience. And we need this urgently, because increasingly the issues that concern us are technical and scientific in nature. The basic notion that there's an interaction between a historically modulated life world and the sciences, I think that notion is fundamental to Marcuse's thought, and it is fundamental to our own situation today, whether we are aware of these theoretical concepts or not. So we need to overcome the obstacles to these transformations of the technosciences. Now, ideally in Marcuse's theory, we overcome these obstacles by creating a socialist revolution. This is not realistic for our present moment. Nevertheless, the struggles over the technosciences do persist. And after all, there were long generations of workers' struggles over capitalism, long before there was any plausibility to the notion of socialist revolution. There's nothing peculiar about us now being engaged similarly in a long series of struggles without any clear sense of how this could result in a radically new social system. But in the meantime, we're going to alter the system that we live in ways that respond to our concerns. And this is something that we have the power to do to an extraordinary degree. Before World War II, it was very unusual and rare for publics to engage with the sciences and technologies that affected their lives. But since World War II, people have had the chance to speak up in a way that was not the case before. Capitalism is now much more vulnerable to public pressures than it ever was in the 19th and early 20th century. And so this is why we have these movements. This is why they are able to initiate changes that would have seemed completely impossible at an earlier stage. And we need to take advantage of this moment, right? And this change in the people are, especially around climate change now. And capitalism is responding to the public pressure to some extent. Maybe we need more pressure, but we're certainly not waiting for them to figure it out for themselves. So there are obstacles, of course, and these social movements exist precisely to address those obstacles, but the obstacles are not absolute. People are not being shot in the street demanding mitigation of climate change in Western countries, in the advanced capitalist world. That could eventually happen, but so far we're okay. So we need to address these essentially corporate and government obstacles and put pressure on them, public pressure. The public sphere has to embrace technology and science as part of its realm. Of course, there are dangers in that. We have the anti-vax movement to prove to us that there is no limit to human stupidity. People are willing to die in order to avoid a chance of 0.008 serious complications. That's the Canadian statistic from the vaccine, 0.008%, which is what, like a 10,000th of the 56 million people who've had a vaccination, 56 million vaccines that have been administered in Canada. I'm not good at math, but I think it's a 10,000 chance. So the chance of getting COVID is so much greater that it's really strange. But this movement exists, it's successful to a considerable extent. So there is a danger in the involvement of the public in technoscience. But so far, when you look at the last 75 years or so of history, huge changes have occurred in medicine and environmental politics that are due to public involvement. And I think the overall, of course, there's a kind of forgetfulness that takes place. Now it seems obvious that you have to have clean air. I mean, who could doubt that you need to have pollution control? Well, there was a time when there were a lot of people who doubted it. When the automobile manufacturers, for example, were busy spending millions of dollars lobbying governments to prevent pollution controls from being introduced. So it's not obvious at all, right? It's just become obvious. That's the way history works, right? The things happen. And I remember reading one example. There are exit signs in theaters everywhere. Why? Well, because people need to get to the exit, right? There's a reason for it. But that reason evidently was not sufficient to get exit signs in theaters in the United States before 1903. In 1903, there was a fire in the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, and hundreds of people died because they couldn't find the exits. And after that, all the city councils in the country demanded that every theater have exit signs. So, it's not that it's irrational to have an exit sign, it's perfectly rational, but the rationality didn't sink home until there was a contingent historical event that made it appear worthy of consideration. And then, oh yeah, that's rational. So we're in the same situation with climate change. Of course it's rational to deal with climate change, but it's not happening because it's rational. It's happening because there was a social movement and a change in public opinion that puts the pressure on to make people take seriously this particular rationality among the thousands that you could worry about. So, okay, so we need to address these questions directly in the political sphere. And we can't wait for the socialist revolution. As Marx says in one of his texts, citing the this phrase, hic rhodus, hic salta. This is the place, do it. Do it here, right? So,
Even Hegel, yes, outlined the phase.
Marx cites it, but it's in Hegel. It originates in Hegel. Yeah, it's a Greek tale, right? Some guy brags that on roads he jumped very high, and so his interlocutor says, "Hic rhodus, hic salta." You know, do it here. It's not good enough to tell me about the fish you fished in some other lake on another day. I want to know about what you can do today. So that's I think the answer that we need to take seriously now. We are in the position of actors in the technosciences, and we have to engage with them. So I'm going to conclude now. That's almost an hour. Sorry. I have here I have a YouTube channel, and you can find some lectures on that channel. And also on my homepage, there are a lot of articles. There's even a book in the translation section. There's a book in Italian called Alternative Modernity that was produced as a thesis by a student in Rome. And then I do have a book in Italian. Tecnologia in Discussione is the Italian version of Questioning Technology, which was one of the, I guess it was the second book I published on technology. So I imagine it's still in print since it comes from ETAS, which is a sort of academic publisher, commercial academic publisher. So I hope you can find it if you're curious. And Technosystem is the latest book on technology, which contains a lot of the things I've talked about today.
Thank you, Andrew. We have plenty of time for discussion. We have many curiosities. I do have many.
Questions?
Questions, yeah. So who starts?
Students go first.
Okay.
So I feel like a student.
I don't know I had that effect on people.
Anyway, so I will break the ice here, and I'm sure we'll have a long conversation. You also have a book on Marcuse in press,
yes.
which had the advantage of reading at least some parts. So one aspect I think is very interesting in your analysis of Marcuse in general, great potential that they see is that it doesn't fall in a trap that you also mentioned by other scholars, that is to either to obliterate the critique of technology or to make it so extreme that there is no way out. So the problem is then science as science. And if science is science or technology, technology is the problem, then there is no way out. So I think that the question, at least the question of a successor science, successor technoscience is a crucial one, and it's one that Marcuse helps us to think. So his statement or his claim that the problem is not technoscience, but it's technoscience under a capitalist regime.
Yeah.
That's the starting point for a political reflection on technoscience. So this said, which I think is something to really to be emphasized here, and it helps us to think in political terms of the technoscience we live in, because we name the social structures and their historicity. So if we say capitalism, we are already addressing the political, social, and the historical dimension of the problem. So I'd like to I don't know if to add, but to integrate or to reflect on the three critiques of technology that you pointed out, to to ask you where the practical, you pointed to that, but it was not so central in the scheme you proposed us, the practical dimension of science. So you pointed to consequences, to the structuring of our societies through science, but the ideological dimension, including the ideological material dimension, was very central in terms of the ways technoscience legitimates the world we live in, and it shapes in a convenient manner for the status quo. What about science as a force of production? So I'm bringing it in the matrix of production and reproduction of society, and the connection with labor. And with labor, I say labor to use a sort of referent term that opens up a chain of thoughts, but also to point to the practical transformative dimension of science, both in its roots and in its consequences. My question is, how can we link this concept of world transformation through science with the concept of Lebenswelt, or the word of life coming from phenomenology, which seems to me points rather or emphasize the dimension of experience, the mental dimension even of the ontology, but even the image of reality that is produced by abstraction is not thought in continuity with the other dimension of science, which is not Weltanschauung, but is the product of practices that bounces back to a transformation of the world.
Well, basic sciences like physics and tools like mathematics do not directly change the world, right? These are contemplative objects of the mind. They change the world in conjunction with technosciences that incorporate their insights and tools into consideration of an object of some sort, of a concrete object. That's how you get from the formal abstractions to something that matters in the material world. So, so science is productive, but it's only productive in conjunction with these mediating technical disciplines that enable it to affect the world. So, without sophisticated mathematics, you can't do, say, build a building today. You need the mathematics in order to calculate all the things that are going on. But your object is the building, right? This object is not itself part of physics. It's something external to the science. And you bring the science in as a tool, a method. This is actually what Husserl says, that in the modern world, we have confused what is only a method for an ontology. So we think of physics as telling us what's real, when actually what it does is helps us to do things with the real. It's not the same at all. So there's this is why the technosciences become the scene on which the struggle takes place. No matter how convincing the critique that Heidegger might make of, or Husserl of physics, no social movement is ever going to emerge that says, physicists, you need to do this rather than that. There's no way that, because physics doesn't directly impact human concerns. Those concerns are impacted indirectly by it through the objects that are constructed by the technosciences. Technical designs, what we think of as the human body, right, in medicine and so on. So the productive quality of science, which is of course a theme in a lot of Marxist thought in the 60s and 70s, the scientific and technical revolution theory and so on, seems to have sort of blurred over the fact of these necessary mediations, which turn out to be the scene on which there is a politics. Whereas in those earlier Marxist arguments, it was not really about politics, but about the changes in the productive forces in some sort of deterministic kind of scheme of development. But today we see that's not correct. I mean, they were correct to point out that science is a productive force, right? But it's only a productive force in this connection, right? And then it turns out that in this connection, it is politically sensitive in a way that they didn't imagine in the 60s and 70s when they developed these Marxist theories of science and technology. And that was already an advance, right? Because they already understood that capitalist society was no longer just a lot of steam engines. Right? They figured out that something had happened, but they didn't understand the politics of what they were writing about. Yes.
Thank you very much. And mine aren't actually questions, are more like comments on what you think, because I agree with your idea that social movements can have an impact on the object of science. It's really an exciting, idea, and also you seem to me really optimistic to the outcomes. But my concern, so to say, was between this relationship to the rise between movement, social movement, political activism, and as object of knowledge. So, for example, I was wondering how much a local movement, for example, a local request, you mentioned the problem with air pollution in Los Angeles, can have an impact on a global capitalism. And at the same time, for example, nowadays we can actually see that some of the principles of the environmental ideas or feminism are incorporated in the capitalist structure, for example, through the greenwashing or the pinkwashing, phenomenon. So if this is a risk, a concrete risk that we can so to say, erase completely these actually really innovative social movements because they are incorporated in capitalist global structure. And then there's also, I was wondering about the relationship between the expert and the social movements. And you mentioned, for example, the Novaks, so the fact that lay persons, so to say, doesn't trust science anymore. But at the same time, can actually also happen that experts don't engage with the public because they are experts. So until the public doesn't gain authority, okay, there's no point to listen. So
I've got 3 things to talk about so far.
Yeah,
I better start with those.
Really,
if you have more, you can have a second round.
Yeah, the second round.
But I can't remember more than 3 things. That's enough for my mind.
Yes.
So globalization, co-optation, and lay expert relations. Those are the 3 things I've got so far.
So basically, we, social movements shouldn't just change the object of science, but also who does science. Not just from an identity point of view. I'm just talking about like cultural change about what the expert means in our society.
Okay, so let me start with the first thing you mentioned, which is how can a local movement have a wide impact?
Yeah.
Well, I had appendicitis in Italy when I was young, and I had an operation, and it worked. I'm still here. It was exactly the same operation I would have had in Los Angeles or in New York or in Tokyo. So what's happened is the globalization of the technosciences has made a uniform, a world that is uniform, homogeneous in a way that was never the case before. And that has an impact because if a local movement can affect for example, Los Angeles, and that then has an impact on the automobile companies, people all over the world start to worry. Uh-oh, that's the beginning of something. If it could happen there, it could happen here. And so, and as the response is made in one place, it's made in terms of changes in the technical discipline, which is then transmitted elsewhere. It's accessible. Everyone reads in English, right? So, at least in technical fields. So it is necessary that the action have a local kind of base to start with, but it can spread quickly, especially now, of course, with the internet, among the public, and it can also reach the institutions and spread through them through changes in the technical disciplines. And that can be also a question for, you know, the corporate leaders who, you know, they get the idea, uh-oh, we are running an automobile company and something's happening in Los Angeles. And even though we're in France, at some point we may have to deal with this. But in the meantime, let's bribe some people in the government. So that's how it works. So second was the problem of co-optation. Of course, the people in charge have their traditions and their habits and their interests, and they are going to try and incorporate to sort of metabolize the public action within their own system. You know, there's a whole systems theory for discussing this kind of thing, right? The system incorporates the environment. It is informationally closed, but it allows elements from the outside in and so on. This is autopoiesis, but in reality, there is no such closed system in a modern society. There's always leaks from the outside. And this is why capitalism is so successful, because it is constantly changing, adjusting to a changed environment. And the one thing, of course, that it retains in every iteration is the pursuit of profit. But that leaves a huge margin. That's very formal, right? There's a huge margin for changing everything else, so long as it's possible to continue as a business, to make money. So co-optation is a standard strategy, and to some extent it is actually defeats the purpose of the social movement, right? Like in the case of the greenwashing you talk about. If it's really extreme greenwashing, like, you know, buying pollution credits that are in fact fake because they're in the third world country where they're supposed to be doing something good for the environment, people are just taking bribes and nothing is happening. I mean, that's, you know, completely fake. That's terrible. But mostly, I think what happens is much more complex. Marcuse says at one point that every social movement is ambivalent because it has, on the one hand, it points toward a different social world, and on the other hand, it has to be incorporated into the given world. This is true up to the point where the socialist revolution takes over, which we're not waiting impatiently for, right? So this ambivalence of social movements means that they're always exposed to co-optation, but that's not a reason to give up. That's a reason to keep pressing harder and demystifying the co-optations, you know, criticizing the tricks that are played. So, and we see that's in fact what's happened with environmentalism, right? The automobile was not killed off by the environmental movement. On the other hand, we can breathe, which is a good thing. So, so they did absorb the impact of the social movement in their own way, but the result is still an advance. So, okay, the third thing was lay-expert relations. Lay-expert relations are, it's a concept that was developed first, I think, in relation to medicine. You go to the doctor, and you show him your symptoms, and he then tells you what it is and gives you the medicine that cures you. And it's a perfect system in which you are simply an object. Right? And all the subjectivity is on the side of the doctor, at least until you leave and decide whether or not to take the medicine he prescribed. Then you become an agent, but only in a bad way, right? You decide not to take the medicine. So that was a model of medical relations that was overthrown by sociologists who studied what actually happens. And what actually happens is much more complicated because there is interaction between the patient and the doctor. And eventually, as social movements around medicine emerged in the 70s, it became clear that these interactions were not just individual, they were collective. So if you went to the hospital to deliver a baby in 1970, there was a whole thing about, how you were going to do this. Were you going to do this the traditional way with the anesthetic and so on, or the new way, which was based on, exercises, breathing methods, and so on. So, I mean, it became controversial. How do you have a baby? I mean, what could be less controversial? What could be more a case of the expert authority in charge and the patient just lying there and letting it happen? And yet childbirth became a public issue. So in which ordinary people had something to say. And so then with the environmental movement, you saw similarly a tremendous lay input. And the lay input is based on priorities that are different, perhaps, from those of the institutions that employ the experts. Right? So it's not so much that the experts are at fault, they have a tradition. And that tradition has been shaped by a world in which capitalists could ignore workers and communities. That was not their problem, right? That was somebody else's job. So the disciplines then contain many flaws that you would want to remove in the course of progress, right? Of the development of those disciplines by in an environment where workers and communities get to have a say, what's wrong with the disciplines becomes obvious. Things that seemed hard suddenly turn out not to be hard at all. Like having a partner in the labor room, in the delivery room. I mean, that was terrible, unsanitary. You couldn't possibly allow that. And then, yeah, you could allow it. Suddenly, what seemed like a hard scientific fact became a social choice. So by the introduction of the concerns of communities and workers through social movements and changes in public opinion, you begin to discover what is hard and what is soft, what is actually a product of the capitalist environment and what is actually something you just can't, I mean, it's nature. So like the vax movement, the anti-vax movement is making the mistake of thinking that something hard is soft. But the women who demanded changes in childbirth procedures had actually identified something that was soft, but was being taken for hard. So the lay-expert relationship is complicated also ideologically, because if you're an expert, I mean, of course, there are experts who have no conscience, no sense of vocation, right? Who just, that's how I make my living. A lot of them are working for Facebook. So, fuck society. I get mine. But there's also, I think, a much larger majority of people with expert skills who think they're doing something useful for other people. They're serving the community somehow. And if there's protest movements that call into question their expertise and their actions, the meaning of their actions, this is disturbing for them. They don't want to hear that. They want to. So the most extreme case of this was in the May events in France in 1968, when everyone was on strike. So all these people with expertise, management people, government people, they all suddenly were saying, oh my God.
Except the police.
Pardon?
Except the followers of the code.
Well, the military was, and the police did not have any problems of conscience. But everybody else in the cadre of the society was suddenly challenged because they thought they were doing something in the public interest, and the public is now saying, you know, you're not. So I was there, and I witnessed interesting experiences. There's a union of cadres, in other words, executives and engineers. This union has a headquarters in Paris. And for some reason, I was present when a whole bunch of people from that union broke down the door of the headquarters and entered the headquarters and made a call to all the cadres in France to go in to join the general strike. Now, I mean, a lot of people did join the general strike, but a lot of people didn't have any choice because their company was, you know, closed. The workers had occupied the factory or the ministry. There was also the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development put out a tract saying, our General Assembly has discovered that we are not serving the people. We are, in fact, the obstacle they would all like to overcome. So they're joining the movement. So, I mean, this is an amazing phenomenon that could only happen in a revolutionary situation, right? But on a much smaller scale, I think it's present everywhere in where people with expertise are challenged publicly. And they may have resistances and be defensive and so on, but in the end, they're going to adjust because their identity is bound up with public service. And I mean, I guess sometimes maybe they just become cynical, but I think mostly people, I mean, I don't think obstetricians have become cynical because they now have to let the husband or the partner into the labor room. I mean, you know, they just adjust to this. This is the way I'm serving pregnant women now. Huh? So, okay, so those are your three comments. If you have more.
So we'll have comments afterwards.
Yeah.
So you go. So yeah, and then Roberta. And
First Roberta and then myself.
Oh,
Okay.
great.
No, okay. So I'm just interested in what you said in the preamble
Uh-huh.
to your presentation, when you said that our discussion over technology and the concept of technology and the nature of technology at the philosophical level is divided up in maybe two pieces. On the one hand, the Deleuzian strategy of justification of technology, and on the other hand, Latou's, the late Latou's vision of technology, concept of technology. And at one point of your presentation, you touched upon the question of technoscience as something that structures our life world. And this is something that you drew upon from Marcuse's theoretical framework, philosophical framework.
I sort of extrapolate.
Yeah, extrapolate
Yeah.
from Marcuse's theoretical and philosophical framework.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if we could connect these two pieces of our theoretical debate over technology, over the nature of technology, by bringing in our discussion over technology itself, the Foucauldian legacy, the Foucauldian heritage. Because Foucault, the late Foucault, at the end of 70s, in his writings on biopolitics and biopower, says that we should understand the biopower and the different biopolitical strategies in terms of techniques.
Mhm.
Because they are devices, they are technical devices that are used in order to control our bodies.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if we could add up to the list you have made in the introduction to your presentation, this kind of, this sort of Foucauldian theoretical and philosophical strategy. Even though I am skeptical about it, I have many doubts about it at the philosophical level, but I'm wondering if we could enlarge your theoretical perspective on technology by bringing in the Foucauldian legacy.
Yeah, I think there are, Foucault is the closest to Marcuse and to what I want to make with Marcuse's thought of all the thinkers of this period. There's differences, of course, but the idea of, I guess the emphasis of the idea of biopower on control of the body seems to me sort of rhetorical. I mean, it isn't just control of the body, it's everything. It's structuring a way of life. I'm not sure why he wants to emphasize so much the body. That seems to come out of his discipline and punish earlier concerns with. But the basic idea that the modern state is not simply trying to squash people down and keep them dominated, but also promotes their existence in a certain way. That idea is correct, and that's what it means to talk about technification. And
it's part of a technological experience,
yeah.
in a sense.
And so the idea of the one-dimensional society is rather similar. Marcuse isn't saying that the capitalists are just squashing everyone down, and he's saying they're constructing a whole way of life for people. And people like that way of life. They get used to it and they find a satisfaction in its many aspects of it. And this is also what I think Foucault really intends us to understand by the difference between a sovereign power and the modern form of power.
Even though Foucault clashes with Marcuse.
Well, he doesn't know anything. He doesn't know anything. You know? Yeah. He makes it up. In fact, there is an interview in which he says that he regrets not having known about the Frankfurt School earlier. That would have enabled him to avoid many silly mistakes. So certainly what he writes about Marcuse in the sexuality book is silly. Marcuse's concept of repressive desublimation anticipates his own notion of sexuality. So he could have cited Marcuse instead of criticizing him. On the other hand, there's another side to besides the biopolitics argument, there's also the subjugated knowledges concept, the connaissance as sujetti, which is essentially a Lebenswelt type concept of knowledge. There's the knowledge that emerges specifically in relation to the different technical systems. And these knowledges are the subjugated knowledges, the knowledges of the users or victims, the ordinary people who engage with one or another technical system. So their Lebenswelt is characterized not just by certain feelings or practices, but also by ideas. They know certain things. And I think this is an excellent idea. This is a good idea. It makes the Lebenswelt a lot more specific and useful for understanding conflict between ordinary people and the technical systems in which they're inserted. See, the problem is that what Foucault understood was that the interests and concerns of people are relative to the specific technical environments that they're inserted into. But these are not some sort of universals. I mean, they could be classed under universal concepts, like health is a universal that everyone can accept in every society. Health is a good thing. But specifically, the health that's involved in being a citizen of Los Angeles in 1962, that's the specific knowledge that you have, that your health is being harmed by this yellow cloud that covers the sky, and that you cough it up every morning. That specific knowledge then becomes active through social pressures on the automobile industry. So that's a subjugated knowledge. It's not a formal knowledge like a science. On the other hand, it's not wrong. It's not simply wrong. It is, in fact, quite accurate. It does reveal some aspect of the situation that's hidden to the specific technical disciplines by their boundaries, by the way they've divided the world up. So, when you can't breathe in the morning, you go to the doctor. You don't go to the automotive engineer. Those separations are products of a certain tradition, of a history. And that history has to be altered. And it's the pressure from below, the subjugated knowledges that give people the means to generate new concerns, new ways of thinking in the technosciences. I mean, I think all of this is consistent with Foucault's position. Although he didn't use the same terms that I'm using, I think he could have recognized what I'm saying as consistent with his argument. Now, the big difference, though, between him and Marcuse as a Frankfurt School person is that there's no concept of reason in Foucault. They're just specific types of reasons. And since there's no concept of reason, there's no way really to get beyond the specific interchanges between the subjugated knowledges and the technical disciplines. There's no way to get to a larger concept of social transformation. Like,
even though he elaborated on that, expanded on that in the archaeology of knowledge at the end of the 60s.
where he has some,
he tried to make like a genealogy of knowledge and of the concept of representation throughout the history of science.
But there's no future. He can't generate a concept of the future.
That is a history of reason, of rationality.
Yeah, but it goes only backward, doesn't go forward.
So thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. I apologize for.
That's too bad you missed the beginning, but it's all recorded.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there was a misunderstanding on my part. So I would like you to go back a little bit on your concept of potentiality. Because if I understood well, you said that in modern technoscience, the concept of potentiality has been somehow erased. I would like to know your opinion about the current times in which somehow potentiality seems to be back again, especially in the shape and in the domains and discourses of and practices of artificial intelligence, big data, and so on, in which it looks like that those second qualities are somehow incorporated in the rigid framework of technoscience. So I'd like to know your opinion about that.
Well, I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I can say this much. The concept of potentiality has a correlate in science, but it's a peculiar correlate because it here's where you can see the the Lebenswelt science connection in an interesting way. There is in physics potential energy. So like the computer has the potential energy that would be released if we dropped it on the floor.
The other one.
This one, right? So this is obviously derived from the everyday life notion of potentiality, right? That things can be more than what they are at the present moment, that they can become something more. So, and yet it is different because it's so narrowly prescribed, right? It's a measurable attribute that is prescribed by the situation of the object. And it's different from a potentiality, say, of a child to become what? You know, all sorts of mysterious things, or the potentiality of a society to transform itself. And so there's an element, there's a kind of utopian element in the notion of potentiality as it exists in everyday life, which you have to eliminate to get something precise that can work inside of science. And I think this is true of many concepts like consistency. Consistency is certainly a useful idea in engineering. You want, you know, the power supply to be consistent for the different devices that are going to use it and so on. But consistency in everyday life also includes all sorts of normative things, like being fair and so on. So you have a kind of reduction of that this is where the second dimension gets cut off, right? So that you can make these concepts operational inside of science. Now, as for the question of artificial intelligence, I'm not sure I understand where the concept of potentiality operates in artificial intelligence. Maybe you could.
I'm an anthropologist, and I speak as an anthropologist looking at scientists working with big data and artificial intelligence software and systems.
Right.
And what they tell me is that their systems are able to map specific context. And given that those systems are able to aggregate different kinds of data, even including kind of secondary quality, we want to call it, the configuration that might emerge might be surprising for science as we know it so far.
Yeah.
And therefore, in their words, there is always this sense of potentiality, surprise, and possibility that the results will be different from what we have expected so far. For example, you spoke before about the concept of the speed and distance and whatever, and those same scientists told me that in history, the speed, the quantification of the speed of light, I remember, has changed, but not because the measurement has been more precise, but because they understood that the error was bigger. Therefore, error and potentiality somehow are different words to express this idea that in these big data scenarios, this space for uncertainty and probability and surprise, and therefore also probably potentiality, might be enlarged instead of erased.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Can I?
What is potentiality? What is
Can I-
potentiality in your framework?
I would make a proposal, since, sorry, I'd like to go on discussing this, and we will keep discussing that today. But since it's almost 6, I propose we get one last question, one last answer. We take potentiality and artificial intelligence, interesting issue for the aperitif.
Yeah.
Sorry
I
for
believe
being
it.
so reductive, but I think there are people also waiting for us. And Julio, you are
Yes. Sorry, Pietro. Just a question, because we cannot join you for the drinks afterwards. So
That's a pity.
might this also be an option or not? It's already late, I know.
We have a question in the room. Perhaps
Okay, fair enough.
Yours, and then
I'll answer quickly.
And then Andrew will have the final say before we close. So it's your responsibility when we finish, Andrew.
Okay.
In other words.
So what is the question?
And may I now, or the person in the room?
First, Julie in the room, and then you.
Yeah.
Lucas.
Okay. Thank you so much for your wonderful speech. I was particularly interested by your defense of Marcuse's critique of technology, Marcuse's political critique of the capitalist use of technology, especially because in Italy in the 60s and the 70s, the communist intellectuals linked to the Communist Party, Gramscian communist intellectual, looked at the Frankfurt School with sort of distrust. Okay, because they were linked to the old
proletarian movement. Yeah.
So there was a political reason, but even a theoretical one. They believed that in the Frankfurt School there was a sort of fatalistic, desperate critique of an almost completely alienated capitalist world. So my first curiosity is, where does Marcuse's perspective on technology differ from those of Adorno and Horkheimer? So the first question, first curiosity is this one. And the second one concerns precisely Gramsci. So I'm interested in whether it plays a role in your critique of technology, because, okay, you mentioned the idea of historicism, absolute historicism as a common element in the Western Marxism in Europe, between Lukács and Gramsci. Okay, I know you wrote a book on philosophy of praxis. So absolute historicism would be a device able to overcome the divide between nature and culture, between humanities and science and technology studies, etc. But you also mentioned the idea, and you emphasized it, the idea of translation. And as you know, one of the core concepts in Gramsci's philosophy is precisely the idea not of translation, but of translatability. The title of some notes in the notebook 11 is precisely translatability of scientific and philosophical languages. So I would like to ask you if this idea of translatability could be useful in your theory, in your critical theory of technology.
The first question, I think Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse shared a very similar view of technology, critical view. But Marcuse went beyond them in developing this phenomenological critique and notion of successor science, which they don't entertain. As for the second question, I've read quite a bit of Gramsci, but I don't remember reading that particular passage. I have a vague sense that maybe I've seen it, and that it was about translating to public knowledge, scientific concepts, something like that. See, there's a long tradition of scientists trying to communicate to the public. What's new is this public communicating back to the scientists. And I don't think that Gramsci entertained that idea.
No, the idea of translatability is a very complex notion, but the idea is the translatability of the philosophical.
But it includes technology.
Yeah, it includes
technology.
Yeah,
this is one of the interesting points of visual optics.
Yeah. It is
philosophy can translate itself into technology, and technology can translate itself into philosophy, because there is an interaction between common sense and philosophy
So if,
commonsensical
yes.
beliefs and philosophical claims.
So we could, if there's a, this is the question would be, of course, so far everything sounds fine, but the question would be, does Gramsci entertain the notion that the changed common sense of the people as they assimilate scientific and technical languages and concepts, that this changed common sense could then react back on science and technology and alter them?
Yeah, precisely.
Does he say that?
Yeah. Common sense is one of the main fields of struggle for him.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. I'm talking about the other direction.
Yeah, the other direction. Yeah.
So science and
Reacts
technology.
back upon philosophy of science and science.
But let's give Lucas his chance, and then we discuss Gramsci. So sorry to be so rude, but so Lucas, it's on you now. Final question, final answer.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting your Gramsci session, but you will have enough drinks hopefully to look through all the cartridge and everything. So thank you very much. First of all, my question would be on the idea you were also talking about, I think, you will be talking about in your newest book about the bias of neutrality of science, which I really liked a lot. And I mean, we see this nowadays, that if we see nature no longer as a teleological entity, then this precisely makes it possible to subsume it under the telos of capital's exploitation. Or if we see that nature has no norm or worth to be followed in itself, then we can freely dispose of it, and we can use it for whatever purposes we wish it to be, right? Or if we think that nature has no value in itself, then we can use it best for the capital value and the interests of capital. So I like this idea that there's the very neutrality of science is itself a certain bias towards the capitalist exploitation of nature. Now, my question would be, since science is industrialized since about 100 years, and it thus needs big capital, right, nowadays. So we have huge institutes nowadays. It's not that a tiny little nice ingenious scientist individual, creates all the content of the world or whatever, but there are huge institutes and they need lots of money. And therefore I would say, and to a certain degree, they need big capital to finance research, right? So therefore, there might be a certain combination of knowledge and interest, or an interrelation between the two, if we want to use the Habermasian two terms. And then the question would be, what goal or what telos or what function science should serve, right? The question would not be, is science embedded in a society? Is science somehow embedded in a political horizon, but which political horizon do we want to share, or in which direction do we want to go? So in that sense, one could say that, like, Aristotle is back, if you want. Like, the question of teleology and the question of potentiality is back in the game within science, since the question then is not that much the question of pure science only, but rather the question, do we want to serve the goal of capital or of big corporate interests, or do we want to serve the question of humanity or of emancipation? And that then would be the question, do we want to serve the interests of capital or of human well-being? So in that sense, one could say potentiality and teleology are back into the question of science, since science needs to be financed anyway by society in the long run. And then the question would be what to be researched and which ways to go scientifically. So I wondered whether you think this might be thought together, or whether that's a bollocks idea to bring Aristotle and the concepts of teleology and potentiality back into this kind of idea of the neutrality of science. Thank you very much.
The teleology has always been there in the common sense of ordinary people, the Lebenswelt, the life world of everyday ordinary people. They've always had a teleological understanding of certain things, for example, of life, of human life, of plants and animals. And this teleology is this. This is the second dimension in one of its forms, right? Which is part of the fundamental understanding of existence of people in forever, right? Since the beginning. So now what's new is that this teleology tries to, I mean, modern science was constructed by eliminating this teleological perspective, but now that the public intervenes in scientific decisions about the orientation of science, about the construction of scientific objects, the teleology returns, and it turns out to be pertinent to the science through this translation that mainly concerns the nature of the object. What are the boundaries of the object? What are what kind of an object is it? And that's a way of translating a teleological conception into a scientific conception. So the science continues to be non-teleological, but its object now pushes it, somehow orients it in a way that corresponds to a teleology that's explicit in the discourse of ordinary people. So the first and most obvious example of this is medicine. Right? There's an infinite number of parameters of the human body, but medicine isn't interested in most of them. It focuses on a tiny, tiny subset, which happen to be those that concern human health, and especially the problems of health that medical science can actually address. But there's a million other things going on that it just isn't interested in. So the object that medical science addresses is teleological, but it's a translated teleology. Right? It's not an Aristotelian type teleology. That Aristotelian stuff goes on in everyday life, where we think about, our kid growing up. But in the medical field, it's reduced and restructured in a way that reveals the same significance, but through a translated object rather than the scientific concept of potentiality. So I think it's what you're saying. I mean, the problem with the Habermasian formulation was that it's kind of bureaucratic. It's too much about, how we are going to decide what to be. Well, the we, collective we, is pretty impotent because it's, it just doesn't know enough. It's not interested enough. The we that actually is effective in changing the direction is the we that emerges through social action and through changes of public opinion. That we does have an impact, but it's a complicated process. It's not something like a bureaucratic process and when it is bureaucratic, then you get weird results, like the EU deciding that we're going to have a grant program on robotics, because so why? Who told them that was what was the important thing to study? Where did they get that idea? And is it actually interesting? I mean, you have philosophers running around trying to think up something useful about robotics they can sell to the EU when they don't. I mean, I'm really suspicious of the bureaucratic organization of scientific change. I remember my father was a physicist, and he was one of those guys you were talking about. All his equipment consisted in was a yellow pad and a pencil. But he was once invited to the Pentagon to talk about giving out money to people who had useful things for the national defense. And one of the things that came up was something in cosmic ray studies. And the idea was that you could use this cosmic ray thing to tell fake missiles from real missiles when the Russians attacked. And my father embarrassed everyone by saying, well, it was an interesting project, but he just didn't see how it could really detect the fake missiles, which of course you weren't supposed to say, because the idea was just to get Pentagon money into physics. So you know, that's what's going on, right, with the bureaucratic process. People are gaming the system to the best of their ability. But the real thing, when people have a real concern and they're sufficiently engaged and conscious of what's going on to do something about it, that I think has major impacts and has significantly changed science in the last 70 years or so. I didn't really answer your question, but I don't think I know how, because I'm not sure what the unexpected, whether the unexpected constitutes a potential or something else. You know, maybe we need a different way to think about it rather than yeah. It's a.
Join me to thank Andrew.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.
Thank you all. See you soon.